Chapter 4. As promised, Richard walked or rode beside me every afternoon from that day onwards. I was aware of Brian's presence, but he was very good at keeping his distance and allowing us to be together without actually being alone. Those hours I spent in Richard's company were truly the happiest of my life. We would ride together and talk about anything that came to mind. The best thing, though, was that he laughed and smiled almost all the time. It warmed my heart to see him like that. He was so handsome when he smiled, and his eyes glinted with happiness. One day, during the first week we started riding together, I broached a subject I felt a little insecure on. Edward has been pestering me, trying to find a way for me to be happy while also being safe. Why haven't you told him about this arrangement? Richard stopped his horse and looked at me. I also reined in, and when he didn't say anything, I added, "You did tell him you were worried about me. He's been very attentive and caring these past days, but since you haven't told him that you've solved my predicament, I didn't dare tell him either." Still, Richard squirmed in the saddle and said nothing. "He'll be very angry with me if he finds out we've resolved this and all the while left him to come up with a solution. Is there really any reason he shouldn't know? He trusts you, as I do. He knows you will take good care of me just as well as he would." "But would he approve?" Richard finally blurted out. "As your brother, he's very much aware of your social standing and such, and he's terribly protective of you." "Edward? Protective? Whatever was he talking about?" "You are talking about my stupid big brother who pulled my hair out and tried everything in his power to get me to cry, am I right? The same big brother who took me down to the beehive so they would sting me? The same Edward who let me fall into the pool when I was 2 and couldn't swim? When has Edward ever been protective of me? Whatever do you mean, Richard?" He shook his head in exasperation. "Ed will intimidate and challenge to a duel anyone of the other young men who dares to say you are a commoner. Any thoughtless comment made at court about you or your mother sends him into fits of silent but controlled rage. I think Ed would tear apart anyone who dared harm you, and I'm absolutely certain that if anyone ever approached you romantically, if they wanted to spend time with you like I am now, he'd probably want to rip their heads off." My head spun. The world just wasn't making any sense anymore. A protective Edward had never even entered my worldview. He had been nice of late, certainly, but I thought it had been more due to Mother's death than any real consideration for me. And this description of Edward getting violent, that sounded more like Father, although he would never jump to my defense. But most of all, there was that tiny little confession that Richard really was interested in me romantically. I don't know how long I sat there staring at Richard while my conceptualization of the world and how things worked in it shifted in my mind. It was all very confusing. As things settled into place, the next string of questions surged. "Why are you so worried?" I asked. "You're his idol. You can't do anything wrong. If anyone should be worried about their worthiness in this situation, it should be me." I shuddered to think of all the things he would say about me being unsuitable for you, wasting your precious time in such an inconsiderate, childish manner. Richard gaped at me in confusion, so I clarified. "He's always talking about you. He adores you. He always has. Edward used to pester Mother so much when you weren't here to play, to the point where she insisted Uncle adopt him so he'd be allowed to go and have lessons with you. He worships the ground you tread." "Oh," he said, as though his mind were going through a shift similar to the one I'd just undergone moments before. "I always thought it was my nagging that made it all work out for Ed to be my studying companion. I thought I was the one who looked up to him." Richard trailed off as he processed this new idea. Then he turned back to me and said, "I still don't feel entirely comfortable telling him everything. Maybe you could just mention a solution has been found and he doesn't need to worry about it anymore. Hopefully, he'll just move on and not ask too many questions." That evening I did just as Richard suggested. Edward did not press me for details, and I shrugged the whole thing off. Clearly Richard had overstated Edward's sense of brotherly protectiveness, and I was just happy no one was stopping me from spending every afternoon with Richard in the great outdoors. The very next day, Richard and I were riding along the extreme edge of the king's hunting forest when we came across a rabbit struggling for its life in a snare. Without thinking, I hurried over, dismounted, and set the rabbit loose, heeling it before allowing it to scurry off into the forest. Next, I pulled out a handkerchief from the bag I kept on Mariana's saddle, pulled out a pre-written note, as well as a few coins. Tying the note and the coins into the handkerchief, I attached the little package to the snare, and then turned back to mount Mariana again. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Richard's expression. My mind raced, worried about his reaction. Should I tell him about this little extra activity of mine? I feared he might trivialize it, or worse, reject it as the defense of lawbreakers. I had not thought much of my little attempt to help the destitute who were willing to risk the king's wrath for a rabbit. Afraid of his displeasure, I hesitated. I dropped my gaze, eyes boring into Mariana's caramel shoulder as I went over my options and his possible reactions. Then he was right there, beside me. I sucked in my breath, still uncertain what to say, but coming to the conclusion that silence was worse than any of the possible ways in which Richard might react to my project. I really don't like seeing the poor animals dying in the snares. It makes me uncomfortable, I began. And I'm quite certain no one would risk trapping creatures in the king's forest unless they had no other choice. It somehow didn't feel right to want to punish someone who isn't really causing any true harm, when they are probably very poor and have no alternatives. One does need to eat to survive, after all. And you don't think they could be abusing your kindness, the same hunters constantly trying to get your money? I knew this was not the case. I could somehow sense the reasons why the snares had been set. When I touched them, I saw whispers of images, mostly starving children in small hovels, or sick mothers in dark rooms. I wasn't sure how these pictures could be preserved in the ropes of the traps, but I could sense them, and I had never seen the same family twice. It was always someone new and equally desperate. That was why I started to do my little good deed to help these needy people. They don't tend to use the same knots, I faltered. He snorted, but turned to the next question. And you think it's a good idea to ride around with money on you? It never crossed your mind this could turn you into a target for brigands? No, it had not. Although any bandits would get a nice big surprise when the coins melted in their hands, I thought. I frowned. I didn't have a good excuse. He was right. It could put me in danger if word got out about some stupid rich woman riding around unaccompanied. I was just trying to help, I mumbled in my defense. And the note? What possible use could it serve with illiterate people? The tone in his voice and the look in his eyes upset me. Don't look at me like that. It isn't fair of you to judge me that way. Of course I have good reasons for all of this. Maybe I didn't think about some of the things you mention, but are they really so important? Why should my life be of greater value than another? What possible reason is there to protect me and my honor when I won't be able to marry anyway? There are people out there starving and dying. Some of them risk the consequences of hunting in the king's forest just for a rabbit, for a single meal. How could that be acceptable? How could it be all right for some people to be left with a choice between death from starvation now or death from punishment for poaching later? That's just wrong. And I wanted to do something about it, the little I can do considering my hopelessly useless situation. I mounted up, frustration edging its way into my stance, and nudged Mariana into motion to avoid having to look at Richard right then. I was afraid I might become properly angry with him, because, after all, he had the power and position to stop this kind of suffering, and what had he ever done about it? When he caught up with me, he asked, "How do you know about all this? It doesn't usually feature in a young lady's education, or does it? And why do you even care?" Most women I know are more interested in what gowns to wear for the next ball than in any real issues of our society. "Of course I'm nothing like the ladies at court," I retorted tersely. "They have spent their entire lives being told they can do nothing but think about dresses and balls. They are encouraged to spend as much money as possible on all manner of frivolous things. You can hardly blame them. It is the fault of their education. I was lucky enough to have a socially conscientious mother who raised me to think about other people who suffer hardships far greater than I could even begin to imagine. I slowed Nariana. Speaking of my mother lightened my mood and swept away the irritation which had lined my voice. I continued more kindly. Mama used to help people all the time. They would come to the house and ask for help, and she would always do what she could to assist them for their immediate needs. I think all of our servants were hired because of their need, not ours. Father would often become angry with the expenses he thought were not necessary, while Mother felt we had a duty to help because we had the means to do so. I remember the rows. He even beat her sometimes, but she kept on putting a lot of energy into it, and she would tell me about all the people who came to visit and why they were in such difficulties they could not turn to anyone else. She showed me how the system fails the poor. She taught me that people matter irrespective of the social situation they might have been born into. By virtue of being alive, they have rights, and I firmly believe she was right. That is why I do what I can to help alleviate the suffering of others. After a long pause, Richard said, "Thank you, dear Zibby. You have given me much to reflect on." Then, with his brow furrowed, he returned to silent contemplation. I glowered at the use of my hated nickname. He'd been very attentive until now, not using it at all, but I suppose there were times when he still thought of me in that way. I turned my mind to magic, since it looked like Richard would not be distracting me for a little while. I just taught myself to create a bubble of light to accompany me, hovering or floating along as I wished it to, when Richard frowned more deeply and turned towards me. "You have now, on several occasions, mentioned you don't believe it possible you should marry. Why ever do you think that?" I sighed, allowing the bubble to pop and dissipate. "It's quite self-evident. My mixed status makes me unacceptable for either social sphere. From the way Mother was cut off from the aristocratic circles and how hard she had to fight for Edward to be accepted, I doubt there is any chance whatsoever I shall ever be able to get into those circles. It's just a hopeless fight, what with Mother gone now. She might have been able to call in some favors to get me to be someone's handmaid, but now even that slight possibility has evaporated. As for my chances amongst the traders in Railtown, I wouldn't be able to fit in either. I have no trade, no knowledge of all such things. What use could a man of trade have for a wife who doesn't understand what he does and cannot support him in it? Father would die before he ever let me near his books or taught me anything about his business. And frankly, I prefer not to be in too close proximity to him either. Besides, I know nothing of cooking, cleaning, and taking care of children. I have lived the life of an aristocrat without being one. I am useless and simply serve no purpose." I shrugged and then added more happily, "So I try to find things I can do and focus on those. There's no point dwelling on unalterable facts of one's life. It is much better to focus on one's attention on the things one can do." He had drawn his horse close beside mine and reached over to take my hand. "Don't belittle yourself so, Elisabeth. You are an amazing woman with truly fantastic abilities. You're very kind and have a strong sense of justice. Those are definitely qualities other men besides me think are important for a wife." I had to check myself from saying what I thought. I don't want anyone but you. But my heart also leapt at his words. Could he really mean it? Was there actually hope? Then my realist self stepped in and brought it all crashing down around me. "Watch yourself, Elisabeth. He is the prince. There is no way such a thing would be allowed. Besides, it would take at least 2 years or longer for anything of the sort to even be possible, and his heart will have time to settle on another. There will be so many beautifully preened young ladies attending balls and dancing with him and chatting to him of this and that, something you won't be able to do. And then, of course, there are all the political reasons. They will find him someone whose connections, whose position, whose family will bring the kingdom power and better finances. You have nothing to offer, so don't get your hopes up. All you will achieve then is a great deal of self-inflicted pain. Rather be skeptical, don't expect this to go any further than a lovely time spent together now, while you are young, something to reflect back on tenderly in years to come. But this dream relationship is definitely not a real scenario that could actually come to pass anywhere except in a fairy tale." The manor house came into sight, and we parted ways. Richard and I spoke of all manner of things on our walks. We would often have long discussions that sometimes even broke out into arguments. Our topics were diverse and our opinions definitely diverged, but we had a lot of fun. I loved those hours spent with him. There were even a few occasions when Richard asked for my assistance with his own work. I shall only mention one of them as it was my first encounter with a situation which would come to be very important in the future. We were riding up in the mountains, marvelling at the view from our little meadow. A brook rushed past on one side, and we could see all the way to Railtown, high in the mountains at the one end of the valley, and the tiniest shimmering glimpse of the ocean on the other. Richard stopped and dismounted, so I followed suit, and we sat in the flower-dotted grass listening to the buzzing of the busy insects and drinking in the gorgeous view. Richard had been deep in thought for the ride, so I focused my attention on perfecting the little floating ball of light. However, as we sat there, he finally told me what was on his mind. "I have been set a difficult task by my mother," he began. "She would like me to make a decision on a rather delicate situation, and I feel she is testing me. I think a lot rests on how I handle it, but I can't think of any satisfactory solution. I've been going over the whole thing again and again, but it's no use." He looked up at me uncertain, so I encouraged him to tell me, aware state business was probably none of mine, and flattered he at least wanted to talk about it in my presence, as though I might be able to help him with it. "There is an elf who has been brought in for theft. He's been accused by 3 different shopkeepers in Railtown of having stolen goods from their stores. They insist it was this elf. They alerted the town guards in each case, but nothing stolen was found on him. He did not try to flee and has been insisting he is innocent and that these people are lying because they dislike his kind and would like to be rid of him. He's been living in Railtown for a few months now and says he often encounters shopkeepers who refuse to allow him entrance to their shops because of his race. I'm inclined to believe the elf, but if I openly say so, then all manner of problems would arise. Can you imagine how the town would respond if the 3 human shopkeepers were convicted of lying to the future king to deliberately have a third party harmed? Their punishment would not be accepted by the populace. There would be a lynch mob out to get the elf, and I would probably become the most unpopular king in the history of Vendale. Not to mention I'm not king yet, so they might refuse to allow my coronation." I was silent for a while. What a complex situation. I said, "If it can't be proven that he stole, then nothing can be done against him, right?" He nodded and I continued, "But there is no need to prove the shopkeepers are lying. The elf has not actually accused them of this. He's not asking for redress." His eyes lit up as he understood. "Of course, that's so perfect. Only worry about what the elf is being accused of, not on the implications of what he has said in his defense." Richard thought for a moment and then added, "I'll leave it to the lawmen to bring me the evidence. If there is absolutely no proof the elf stole anything, he is free to go, and too bad for the shopkeepers." "Splendid." I frowned. "What I don't understand is why we humans hate elves so much. I've never really read anything bad about them, only ever heard rumors. Come to think of it, even the fairy tales only speak of them as kind folk who may play pranks on others, but are truly good and take care of the land and its creatures. Hardly behaviour to elicit hatred and a desire to kill them. I just can't bring myself to believe those crazy stories about them eating human children abandoned in the woods, or stealing infants from their cradles." Next thing I knew, he'd drawn me into a tight hug. I sat there pressed up against him for what seemed an eternity while my heart pounded in my ears. He was so warm, his arms so strong, his frame so solid, although his heart seemed to be thudding at the same tempo as mine. I wished I could be with him like this forever, with the musical chirping of the birds nearby and the soft buzzing of the bees at our feet. Just as unexpectedly he let me go again, turning away, while I secretly wished he would have held me longer. That summer we had together was what saved my life in later times, the blissful knowledge that deep down one is loved no matter what one does or says. That summer was my personal little heaven, but like all things it had to pass. As with all summers, winter had to come.